At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. 8. The Mahar Temple. Part 1. The native, apparently uninjured, climbed quickly into the skiff, and seizing the spear with me, helped to hold off the infuriated creature. Blood from the wounded reptile was now crimsoning the waters about us, and soon from the weakening struggles it became evident that I had inflicted a death wound upon it. Presently its efforts to reach us ceased entirely, and with a few convulsive movements it turned upon its back, quite dead. And then there came to me a sudden realization of the predicament in which I had placed myself. I was entirely within the power of the savage man whose skiff I had stolen. Still clinging to the spear, I looked into his face, to find him scrutinizing me intently. And there we stood for several minutes, each clinging tenaciously to the weapon, the while we gazed in stupid wonderment at each other. What was in his mind I do not know, but in my own was merely the question as to how soon the fellow would recommence hostilities. Presently he spoke to me, but in a tongue which I was unable to translate. I shook my head in an effort to indicate my ignorance of his language, at the same time addressing him in the tongue that the Sagoths used to converse with the human slaves of the Mahars. To my delight, he understood and answered me in the same jargon. "What do you want of my spear?" he asked. "Only to keep you from running it through me," I replied. "I will not do that," he said, "for you have just saved my life." And with that he released his hold upon it, and squatted down in the bottom of the skiff. "Who are you?" he continued, "and from what country do you come?" I too sat down, laying the spear between us, and tried to explain how I came to Pellucidar, and where from. But it was as impossible for him to grasp or believe the strange tale I told him, as I fear it is for you, upon the outer crust, to believe in the existence of the inner world. To him it seemed quite ridiculous to imagine that there was another world far beneath his feet, peopled by beings similar to himself, and he laughed uproariously the more he thought upon it. So I gave it up, and asked him about himself. He said he was a Mezop, and that his name was JAC. "Who are the Mezops?" I asked. "Where do they live?" He looked at me in surprise. "I might believe that you were from another world," he said, "for who of Pellucidar could be so ignorant? The Mezops live upon the islands of the seas. In so far as I have ever heard, no Mezop lives elsewhere, and no others than Mezops dwell upon the islands. But of course it may be different in other far distant islands. I do not know. At any rate, in this sea and those nearby, it is true that only people of my race inhabit the islands. We are fishermen, though we be great hunters as well, often going to the mainland in search of the game that is scarce upon all but the larger islands. And we are warriors also," he added proudly. "Even the Sagoths of the Mahars fear us. Once, when Pellucidar was young, the Sagoths were wont to capture us for slaves, as they do the other men of Pellucidar. It is handed down from father to son among us that this is so. But we fought so desperately and slew so many Sagoths, and those of us that were captured killed so many Mahars in their own city, that at last they learned that it were better to leave us alone. And later came the time that the Mahars became too indolent to even catch their own fish, except for amusement. And then they needed us to supply their wants, and so a truce was made between the races. Now they give us certain things which we are unable to produce in return for the fish that we catch, and the Mezops and the Mahars live in peace. The great ones even come to our islands. It is there, far from the prying eyes of their own Sagoths, that they practice their religious rites in the temples they have built there with our assistance. If you live among us, you will doubtless see the manner of their worship, which is strange indeed, and most unpleasant for the poor slaves they bring to take part in it." As JAC talked, I had an excellent opportunity to inspect him more closely. He was a huge fellow, standing, I should say, 6 feet 6 or 7 inches, well developed and of a coppery red, not unlike that of the North American Indian, nor were his features dissimilar to theirs. All in all, JAC was an impressive and handsome creature, and he talked well too, even in the miserable makeshift language we were compelled to use. During our conversation, JAC had taken the paddle and was propelling the skiff with vigorous strokes towards a large island that lay some half-mile from the mainland. The skill with which he handled his crude and awkward craft elicited my deepest admiration, since it had been so short a time before that I had made such pitiful work of it. As we touched the pretty level beach, Jar leapt out, and I followed him. Together we dragged the skiff far up into the bushes that grew beyond the sand. "We must hide our canoes," explained Jar, "for the Mesops of Luana are always at war with us, and would steal them if they found them." He nodded toward an island farther out at sea, and at so great a distance that it seemed but a blur hanging in the distant sky. The upward curve of the surface of Pellucidar was constantly revealing the impossible to the surprised eyes of the outer earthly. To see land and water curving upward in the distance until it seemed to stand on edge where it melted in the distant sky, and to feel that seas and mountains hung suspended directly above one's head, required such a complete reversal of the perspective and reasoning faculties as almost to stupefy one. No sooner had we hidden the canoe than Jar plunged into the jungle, presently emerging into a narrow but well-defined trail, which wound hither and thither much after the manner of the highways of all primitive folk. But there was one peculiarity about this Mesop trail, which I was later to find distinguished them from all other trails that I have ever seen within or without the earth. It would run on plain and clear and well-defined to end suddenly in the midst of a tangle of matted jungle. Then Jar would turn directly back in his tracks for a little distance, spring into a tree, climb through it to the other side, drop onto a fallen log, leap over a low bush, and alight once more upon a distinct trail, which he would follow back for a short distance, only to turn directly about, and retrace his steps, until after a mile or less this new pathway ended as suddenly and mysteriously as the former section. Then he would pass again across some media which would reveal no spoor, to take up the broken thread of the trail beyond. As the purpose of this remarkable avenue dawned upon me, I could not but admire the native shrewdness of the ancient progenitor of the Mesops, who hit upon this novel plan to throw his enemies from his track, and delay or thwart them in their attempts to follow him to his deep-buried cities. To you of the outer earth it might seem a slow and tortuous method of travelling through the jungle, but were you of Pellucidar you would realize that time is no factor where time does not exist. So labyrinthine are the windings of these trails, so varied are the connecting links, and the distances which one must retrace one's steps from the path's end to find them, that a Mesop often reaches man's estate before he is familiar even with those that will lead him from his own city to the sea. In fact, 3/4 of the education of the young male Mesop consists in familiarizing himself with these jungle avenues, and the status of an adult is largely determined by the number of trails which he can follow upon his own island. The females never learn them, since from birth to death they never leave the clearing in which the village of their nativity is situated, except they be taken to mate by a male from another village, or captured in war by the enemies of their tribe. After proceeding through the jungle for what must have been upward of 5 miles, we emerged suddenly into a large clearing in the exact centre of which stood as strange an appearing village as one might well imagine. Large trees had been chopped down 15 or 20 feet above the ground, and upon the tops of them spherical habitations of woven twigs, mud-covered, had been built. Each ball-like house was surmounted by some manner of carven image, which Jar told me indicated the identity of the owner. Horizontal slits, 6 inches high and 2 or 3 foot wide, served to admit light and ventilation. The entrances to the house were through small apertures in the bases of the trees, and thence upward by rude ladders through the hollow trunks to the rooms above. The houses varied in size from 2 to several rooms. The largest that I entered was divided into 2 floors and 8 apartments. All about the village, between it and the jungle, lay beautifully cultivated fields in which the Mesops raised such cereals, fruits, and vegetables as they required. Women and children were working in these gardens as we crossed toward the village. At the sight of Jar they saluted deferentially, but to me they paid not the slightest attention. Among them, and about the outer verge of the cultivated area, were many warriors. These too saluted Jar, by touching the points of their spears to the ground directly before them. Jar conducted me to a large house in the centre of the village, the house with 8 rooms, and taking me up into it, gave me food and drink. There I met his mate, a comely girl with a nursing baby in her arms. Jar told her of how I had saved his life, and she was thereafter most kind and hospitable toward me, even permitting me to hold and amuse the tiny bundle of humanity whom Jar told me would one day rule the tribe, for Jar, it seemed, was the chief of the community. We had eaten and rested, and I had slept, much to Jar's amusement, for it seemed that he seldom, if ever, did so, and then the red man proposed that I accompany him to the temple of the Mahars, which lay not far from his village. "We are not supposed to visit it," he said, "but the great ones cannot hear, and if we keep well out of sight, they need never know that we have been there. For my part, I hate them, and always have, but the other chieftains of the island think it best that we continue to maintain the amicable relations which exist between the two races. Otherwise I should like nothing better than to lead my warriors amongst the hideous creatures and exterminate them. Pellucidar would be a better place to live were there none of them. I wholly concurred in Jar's belief, but it seemed that it might be a difficult matter to exterminate the dominant race of Pellucidar. Thus conversing, we followed the intricate trail toward the temple, which we came upon in a small clearing surrounded by enormous trees, similar to those which must have flourished upon the outer crust during the Carboniferous age. Here was a mighty temple of hewn rock built in the shape of a rough oval, with rounded roof in which were several large openings. No doors or windows were visible in the sides of the structure, nor was there need of any, except one entrance for the slaves, since, as Jar explained, the Mahars flew to and from their place of ceremonial, entering and leaving the building by means of the apertures in the roof. But, added Jar, there is an entrance near the base of which even the Mahars know nothing. Come. And he led me across the clearing and about the end to a pile of loose rock which lay against the foot of the wall. Here he removed a couple of large boulders, revealing a small opening which led straight within the building, or so it seemed, though as I entered after Jar I discovered myself in a narrow place of extreme darkness. "We are within the outer wall," said Jar. "It is hollow. Follow me closely." The red man groped ahead a few paces, and then began to ascend a primitive ladder similar to that which leads from the ground to the upper stories of his house. We ascended for some 40 feet, when the interior of the space between the walls commenced to grow lighter, and presently we came opposite an opening in the inner wall, which gave us an unobstructed view of the entire interior of the temple.